The 1980s weren't just about neon and synthesizers. They were ground zero for the biggest moral panic in Hollywood history. From nuclear nightmares that traumatized entire families to slasher villains that got banned from theaters, these 12 films sparked nationwide protests, congressional hearings, and cultural meltdowns that proved sometimes the most dangerous thing in America wasn't the movies themselves, but the adults who desperately wanted to control what everyone else could watch. Number 12, Faces of Death.
When this organ ceased to function, the result was death. The one reality we cannot avoid.
Here's where things get truly disturbing. This 1978 shockumentary marketed itself as real death footage, compiled by fictional pathologist Dr. Francis B., but what audiences got was a deeply manipulative blend of genuine tragedy and staged horror designed to exploit morbid curiosity. The film presented everything from animal attacks and executions to bizarre cult rituals and Holocaust footage, all narrated with clinical detachment that encouraged viewers to confront mortality in the most sensational way possible. What made Faces of Death so controversial was its deliberate blurring of reality and fiction. The filmmakers mixed actual newsreel footage of accidents and executions with completely staged scenes like the infamous monkey brain eating sequence and fabricated cult rituals. Audiences had no way of knowing what was real, creating an atmosphere of moral ambiguity that left viewers traumatized and ethically confused. The marketing campaign pushed this uncertainty, with rumors spreading that everything was authentic footage, turning the film into a twisted urban legend. Censorship battles erupted immediately across multiple countries. The UK refused classification for years and added it to their notorious video Nasties list during the 1980s moral panic about violent home video content. Video stores faced organized protests and boycotts from parent groups and religious organizations who saw the film as evidence of society's moral decay. Several countries banned it outright, while others demanded extensive cuts that essentially gutted the entire concept. The film's approach to exploiting death for entertainment sparked fierce debates about media responsibility and the ethics of depicting human suffering for profit. Critics argued it desensitized viewers to real violence and suffering, while defenders claimed it forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about mortality. Despite the overwhelmingly negative critical reception and widespread moral condemnation, Faces of Death became a cult classic that pioneered the Mondo film genre and spawned multiple sequels, proving that sometimes the most morally questionable content finds the most devoted audiences. Number 11, Silent Night, Deadly Night.
I'm scared.
Of who, honey?
Santa Claus.
Honey, there's nothing to be scared of.
Imagine thinking you could turn Santa Claus into a slasher villain and somehow avoid the biggest cultural meltdown since someone suggested burning Beatles albums. The 1984 film followed Billy Chapman, a traumatized orphan, who witnesses his parents murdered by a criminal dressed as Santa on Christmas Eve, then grows up in an abusive Catholic orphanage where Mother Superior beats religious obedience into him with a leather strap. When adult Billy is forced to wear a Santa costume at his toy store job, he snaps completely and goes on a murderous Christmas rampage, targeting anyone he deems naughty with axes, box cutters, and creative holiday-themed violence. So what happened when this Yuletide bloodbath hit theaters in November 1984? The most spectacular moral panic the horror industry had ever witnessed. Parents went absolutely nuclear over the film's premise of Santa as a psychotic killer. But the real gasoline on this cultural fire was TriStar Pictures' blatantly tone-deaf advertising campaign, which aired primetime TV spots showing a blood-soaked Santa wielding an axe during family programming like Little House on the Prairie. We're talking about traumatized children having nightmares about Santa Claus, with psychologists warning about potential phobic reactions and behavioral regressions among kids who saw these ads during their favorite shows. Citizens Against Movie Madness, led by outraged mothers, organized massive protests outside theaters with signs reading "Save Santa" and "Santa is not a murderer," while critics like Gene Siskel publicly condemned it as sick and sleazy trash that violated America's most sacred family traditions. The backlash was so swift and brutal that theaters in New York, Wisconsin, and New Jersey pulled the film within days of release, while TriStar completely halted their television advertising and canceled the planned nationwide rollout. Behind the scenes, the studio was in full panic mode as complaints flooded in from religious organizations, parent groups, and traumatized families whose Christmas traditions were forever tainted by images of a homicidal Santa. The film was quietly re-released in 1985 by smaller distributors who avoided all television promotion, turning Silent Night, Deadly Night into underground horror gold. It proves sometimes the most effective marketing strategy is adults telling children they absolutely cannot watch something during the most wonderful time of the year. Number 10, Maniac. What's even stranger is how a low-budget slasher filmed guerrilla style in the gritty streets of New York became one of the most controversial horror films of the early 1980s. Joe Spinell played Frank Zito, a deeply disturbed serial killer haunted by childhood abuse who scalps women and uses their hair to adorn mannequins in his apartment, talking to them like they're alive. Director William Lustig shot the film without permits on location in a crime-ridden New York, giving it an unnervingly realistic documentary feel that made audiences deeply uncomfortable. The film's point-of-view shots forced viewers directly into Frank's twisted perspective during brutal murders, creating an intimacy with violence that felt genuinely dangerous. Censors worldwide went ballistic over Maniac's unrelenting graphic content and bleak psychological themes. In the US, it was released unrated with an adults-only label, then later butchered for an R rating in certain states. The British Board of Film Classification refused classification entirely, effectively banning it from cinemas, and it became notorious as part of the UK's video nasty panic about violent home video content. Australian censors literally blacked out parts of the promotional poster to tone down the graphic imagery. Feminist groups organized protests condemning the film as misogynistic exploitation, while anti-violence activists argued it glorified brutal crimes against women. Behind the scenes, Lustig's guerrilla filmmaking approach and Spinell's harrowing method acting created an atmosphere so intense it reportedly affected the cast and crew's mental state during production. Unlike typical slasher films that relied on stylized kills and dramatic music, Maniac's horror stemmed from its unflinching realism and psychological depth, exploring themes of childhood trauma and mental illness with documentary-like authenticity. The film's stark portrayal sparked debates about media responsibility and the ethics of depicting graphic violence on screen, cementing its legacy as a challenging piece that pushed every boundary Hollywood had established. Number 9. Videodrome.
Nikki, is Max Wren a menace to society?
I'm not sure.
Now here's the thing about David Cronenberg. In 1983, while everyone else was making straightforward horror movies, he was crafting psychological nightmares about television, literally consuming your soul. James Woods played Max Wren, president of a sleazy Toronto UHF station that specialized in softcore porn and trash programming. When his assistant intercepts a pirate broadcast called Videodrome featuring realistic snuff films, Max becomes obsessed with this apparent future of television. The film follows his descent into madness, as his girlfriend disappears while trying to join the program, and Max discovers it's actually the front for a massive conspiracy involving mind control through television signals. Conservative critics went absolutely ballistic over Videodrome's explicit blend of sex, violence, and body horror imagery that showed Max's torso literally transforming into a living VCR with a fleshy slot for inserting tapes. Censorship boards worldwide imposed cuts or outright bans, with authorities arguing that Cronenberg's vision of technology-driven mind control was genuinely harmful and potentially destabilizing to society. What really rattled conservatives was how the film tapped into deep cultural anxieties about television's growing power as a tool of manipulation. This was the early 1980s, when cable TV was exploding and parents were already worried about media influence on their kids. Here comes Cronenberg, suggesting that television doesn't just influence behavior, it physically rewires your brain and transforms your body. The unsettling special effects of flesh melding with machines put a literal face on fears about media consumption becoming inseparable from reality. Critics and scholars recognized the film as a prescient warning about desensitization and the erosion of truth in mass media, but that intellectual complexity didn't stop moral guardians from condemning it as dangerous propaganda disguised as entertainment. Number 8. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer.
I feel like I've known you forever and ever.
Talk about a film that made everyone deeply uncomfortable, including the people who were supposed to rate it for audiences. This 1986 psychological horror followed the daily life of Henry, a drifter and serial killer loosely based on real-life murderer Henry Lee Lucas, played with chilling detachment by Michael Rooker. The film opens with Henry coldly murdering a woman, then cuts to his terrifyingly normal interactions with people around him, including his violent friend Otis, and Otis's sister Becky, who's trying to maintain some semblance of family life. What made Henry so disturbing was its complete lack of typical slasher movie theatrics. No dramatic music, no stylized kills, just stark realism that made viewers feel like they were watching actual documentary footage of a psychopath. The MPAA took one look at this unflinching portrayal of serial murder and slapped it with an X rating, essentially treating it like pornography and killing any chance of wide theatrical release. The filmmakers refused to make cuts, leading to it being released unrated in many markets while struggling to find distributors brave enough to touch it. International censors went even further. The film was banned outright in multiple territories for years, with the UK subjecting it to round after round of censorship battles. The problem was Henry's docudrama approach, using handheld cameras and minimal music, made the violence feel unnervingly real rather than safely fictional. Scenes like the horrifying family massacre were presented with such emotional detachment that audiences couldn't find the usual catharsis or moral resolution they expected from horror films. Critics like Roger Ebert praised it as a profound study of evil that transcended typical horror categories, but that intellectual respect didn't calm the cultural backlash over its relentless brutality and complete lack of traditional villainous motives. Number 7. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2.
right on here, those kids getting killed. Now this is evidence, sort of, right?
What's fascinating is how Tobe Hooper looked at his 1974 masterpiece of restraint and terror and decided the sequel needed more chainsaws, more gore, and Dennis Hopper wielding power tools like a deranged lumberjack. The 1986 follow-up opens with two drunk high school kids terrorizing a radio DJ named Stretch with prank calls, only to get brutally murdered by Leatherface on a bridge while she broadcasts the whole thing live on air. Then Dennis Hopper shows up as Lefty Enright, a former Texas Ranger hunting the cannibalistic Sawyer family, and the film spirals into complete madness involving an underground amusement park decorated with human remains and carnival displays. The MPAA took one look at this gore-soaked spectacle and slapped it with an X rating, forcing Cannon Films to release it unrated. Critics and mainstream audiences were horrified by the shift from the original's gritty realism to what felt like a cartoonish splatter comedy. Word behind the scenes was that Hooper originally wanted to satirize 1980s yuppie culture and materialism, but studio interference under Cannon Films gutted most of that social commentary in favor of straight slasher mayhem. The production was reportedly a nightmare, with extensive gore effects creating a harrowing shooting experience that polarized the cast and crew. International censors went ballistic. The film was banned outright in Germany, Australia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, where it couldn't get classification for decades. Some American theaters pulled it after protests, while others faced local pressure to refuse screenings entirely. Despite all the controversy, or maybe because of it, the film found devoted fans through home video and late-night cable, cementing its status as a cult classic that perfectly captured the 1980s tension between boundary-pushing creativity and moral panic over media violence. Number 6. Friday the 13th.
We haven't seen anybody here, officer.
Just us. This guy Ralph, is he dangerous?
Talk about accidentally creating a monster. Sean Cunningham thought he was making a quick cash grab to capitalize on Halloween's success, but instead unleashed the slasher movie blueprint that would terrorize parents for decades. The film opens in 1958, with two camp counselors getting murdered at Camp Crystal Lake, then jumps to 1979, where a fresh group of teenage counselors arrive to reopen the cursed camp. Despite warnings from terrified locals about little Jason Voorhees drowning years earlier due to negligent supervision. One by one, the counselors get picked off in increasingly brutal ways: arrows through throats, axes to faces, and creative lakeside slaughter. Until final girl Alice discovers the killer is actually Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, Jason's grieving mother seeking revenge on anyone connected to the camp where her son died. So what happened when this gore-soaked slaughterfest hit American theaters? Absolute moral meltdown from critics and parent groups who saw it as the beginning of cinema's moral apocalypse. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert publicly condemned the film as exploitative trash that celebrated teen bloodshed, with religious organizations arguing that the combination of teenage sexuality, drinking, and brutal murders was actively corrupting America's youth and inspiring real-life violence. The moral panic was so intense that parent advocacy groups launched campaigns for increased censorship and stricter film ratings, genuinely terrified that impressionable viewers would see Jason's killing spree and think mass murder was acceptable entertainment. Behind the scenes, the MPAA demanded extensive cuts to secure an R rating, forcing Cunningham to trim the most graphic kills while international censors went completely nuclear. In the UK, Friday the 13th became ground zero for the infamous Video Nasties panic, where government officials and activist groups created literal lists of horror films they considered harmful to society. The franchise's promotional posters were censored for being too violent, with blood and gore digitally removed because communities complained that even the advertising was traumatizing children. This censorship backfired spectacularly, turning uncut versions into underground gold that horror fans traded like forbidden contraband, proving that nothing sells tickets quite like adults telling teenagers they absolutely cannot watch something. Number 5. A Nightmare on Elm Street.
You okay, Tina?
Just a dream, Mom.
Picture this. It's 1984. Parents think the biggest threat to their teenagers is peer pressure and maybe some underage drinking. Then Wes Craven unleashed a burned child murderer who could literally kill you in your sleep. The film followed Nancy Thompson and her friends in the quiet suburban town of Springwood, Ohio, as they're terrorized by Freddy Krueger, a disfigured maniac with razor-blade fingers who hunts teenagers through their nightmares. When Nancy's friend Tina dies horribly after dreaming about Freddy, Nancy discovers the terrifying truth. This monster is the vengeful ghost of a child killer that the town's parents burned alive years ago, and now he's coming for their kids where they're most vulnerable in their dreams. So what happened when this nightmare fuel hit American theaters? Complete parental meltdown. Religious groups and family advocacy organizations went absolutely ballistic over Freddy's sadistic personality and the graphic ways he murdered teenagers, arguing that the film was actively encouraging youth delinquency and making kids afraid to sleep. We're talking about organized campaigns to ban the movie, with concerned parent groups pushing for heavy censorship because they genuinely believed Freddy Krueger would inspire real-life violence among impressionable audiences. The moral panic was so intense that several localities demanded cuts or outright bans, forcing New Line Cinema to release toned-down versions for certain markets just to get theatrical distribution. Behind the scenes, production was pure chaos that nearly killed the film before it could traumatize a generation of moviegoers. Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy, later revealed she experienced multiple near accidents while filming the surreal dream sequences, including working in precarious positions on rigging designed to simulate gravity-defying nightmare logic. International censors had a complete meltdown over Freddy's weaponized glove and graphic kills. In the UK, Nightmare became part of the infamous video Nasties moral panic, getting banned on VHS with scenes trimmed before it could even reach rental stores. This censorship battle backfired spectacularly, turning the uncut version into underground gold that horror fans traded like forbidden contraband. Number 4. Heathers.
Monday morning, your history. I'll tell everyone about tonight.
Here's the thing about 1988, teen movies were supposed to be wholesome John Hughes territory, complete with happy endings and life lessons that made parents feel good about their kids' movie choices. Then Heather showed up like a chainsaw through a Molly Ringwald poster. Winona Ryder played Veronica Sawyer, a smart but disillusioned high school junior trapped in the ruling clique of 3 wealthy, ruthless girls all named Heather. When she starts dating the darkly charismatic outsider, JD, played by Christian Slater, what begins as teenage rebellion spirals into actual murder disguised as suicide. The film's blackest comedy came from how the school community turned each suicide victim into a martyred saint, completely missing that they were witnessing a killing spree. Critics and parents were immediately alarmed by what they called a teen suicide comedy that treated self-harm as satire. This was during the late 1980s when real-life teen suicide clusters were already making headlines, and here was a movie seemingly making jokes about suicide contagion. National newspapers condemned writer Daniel Waters and director Michael Lohman for their gleefully subversive approach to what should have been after-school special material. Behind the scenes, studios were in full panic mode even before the wide release. The original script was even bleaker. The entire school was supposed to explode in the finale, with Veronica and JD dead and a prom sequence set in the afterlife. Studio executives demanded rewrites, terrified of the public backlash, but even the softened version had networks refusing to air it uncut. The film bombed at the box office, partly because of the controversy surrounding its nihilistic tone. But home video and cable transformed Heathers into a cult classic, proving that sometimes the movies parents hate most are the ones that actually understand what teenagers are really thinking. Number 3. Scarface.
You want to have some ice cream? With my friend of me?
Get lost, greaseball.
What's fascinating is how Brian De Palma looked at the American dream and decided to tell its story through a Cuban refugee who snorts mountains of cocaine while machine gunning his way to the top of Miami's drug empire. Al Pacino played Tony Montana, who arrives during the 1980 Mariel boat lift and quickly claws his way up from refugee detention to controlling Miami's cocaine trade. The film follows Tony's brutal rise as he kills his boss Frank Lopez, steals his wife Elvira, and builds a fortress-like mansion funded by Colombian cartel money, only to watch it all crumble as his cocaine addiction and paranoia turn him into the monster he always was inside. So what happened when this 3-hour bloodbath hit American theaters? Absolute moral outrage from every corner of society. Parents and religious groups went ballistic over the film's relentless profanity, with Tony dropping the F-bomb 226 times in a single movie, while critics condemned the graphic violence and what they saw as the glorification of drug culture during America's cocaine epidemic. Conservative commentators demanded bans and tighter ratings enforcement, genuinely terrified that impressionable viewers would see Tony's temporary success and think drug dealing was a viable career path. The Miami Cuban community was furious about being portrayed as violent criminals and drug dealers, feeling De Palma had painted their entire exile community with the same bloody brush. Behind the scenes, production was pure chaos that nearly destroyed everyone involved. Al Pacino actually damaged his nasal passages permanently from repeatedly snorting the powdered milk and baby laxative used as prop cocaine, requiring medical treatment that lasted months after filming wrapped. The physical toll was so severe that Pacino later admitted the fake drug use caused lasting changes to his nose structure. Director Brian De Palma and writer Oliver Stone had such explosive creative clashes that Stone was eventually banned from the set for interfering with actors, while 2 stuntmen were seriously injured in a premature bomb explosion during the mansion siege sequence. The MPAA initially slapped the film with an X rating, forcing multiple cuts before it could secure an R rating and wide theatrical release, cementing Scarface as the ultimate cautionary tale about the price of the American dream. Number 2. The Last Temptation of Christ.
I only came here to serve God. That's all. That's all God wants from me, I'm sure of it.
You know what's wild about the late 80s? Studios thought they could tackle the most controversial religious figure in history and somehow avoid a complete cultural meltdown. Martin Scorsese's 1988 film featuring Willem Dafoe as a tortured, deeply human Jesus wasn't just another Bible adaptation. It was a psychological deep dive into doubt, temptation, and the internal struggle of accepting divine destiny. The movie followed Jesus wrestling with his calling, showing him plagued by visions, crafting crosses for Roman crucifixions, and in the film's most explosive sequence, experiencing a final temptation on the cross where he envisions marrying Mary Magdalene and living an ordinary life. So what happened when this hit American theaters? Complete pandemonium. Conservative Christian groups like the American Family Association and Campus Crusade for Christ organized massive protests before most people had even seen the film. We're talking full-scale boycotts, picket lines, and religious leaders condemning the movie as blasphemous heresy based purely on reports about its content. Universal Studios was so rattled, they took out nationwide newspaper ads defending their decision to release it, arguing that pulling the film would set a dangerous precedent for free speech. But the real chaos was just getting started. In France, Christian fundamentalists literally firebombed a Paris cinema with Molotov cocktails, seriously injuring 13 people who were just trying to watch a movie. Theater owners across America received bomb threats. Cities like Savannah and Oklahoma City managed to temporarily ban screenings entirely, and Blockbuster Video refused to carry it on VHS for years. The Vatican condemned it as morally offensive before it even premiered, and Willem Dafoe later admitted he was shocked by the virulence of the backlash. Number 1. The day after.
Ground observers have confirmed that 2 Soviet-built MiG-25s invaded West German airspace.
Nothing quite says family television night like watching 100 million Americans witness the complete nuclear annihilation of the Midwest in prime time. ABC's 1983 made-for-TV movie followed ordinary people in Lawrence, Kansas and western Missouri as they go about their normal lives. Dr. Russell Oakes performing surgery, farmer Jim Dahlberg working his land, Air Force missile crew member Billy McCoy manning his silo, until escalating Cold War tensions suddenly explode into full-scale nuclear war. When Soviet missiles rain down on Kansas City and military targets across the heartland, the film transforms into a brutal meditation on survival as characters suffer radiation sickness, societal collapse, and the slow death of American civilization itself. So what happened when this apocalyptic nightmare invaded living rooms across America on November 25th, 1983, the single most traumatic television event in broadcasting history? Over 100 million viewers, literally 1/3 of the entire US population, tuned in to watch their own country get obliterated in graphic detail, creating a shared national trauma that had politicians, psychologists, and religious leaders scrambling to process the cultural fallout. Parents reported children having nightmares for weeks, with some viewers requiring actual counseling after witnessing the film's unflinching depiction of radiation victims and societal breakdown. Behind the scenes, ABC was in constant battle with network censors who demanded cuts to scenes they deemed too disturbing for family audiences, including a deleted nightmare sequence involving a child and graphic moments of radiation sickness that director Nicholas Meyer fought desperately to preserve. The Department of Defense monitored the script closely to ensure it wouldn't appear biased or provoke Cold War tensions, while Meyer was forced to avoid specifying which side launched the first nuclear strike to maintain political neutrality. The cultural impact was so profound that President Ronald Reagan reportedly watched it twice and later credited the film with influencing his nuclear policies and arms control negotiations. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a televised national reckoning with the very real possibility of nuclear extinction that turned a TV movie into the most important piece of anti-war propaganda ever broadcast, proving that sometimes the most effective way to prevent real-world catastrophe is to show people exactly what they have to lose.